Thank you all for coming. When I was growing up on St. Mark's Place, I almost never went above 14th Street. So this is really very far for me. So anyway, thank you so much to Fran and Lillian for putting on a really lovely festival. Have people seen the exhibit on the 3rd floor already? It's so beautiful. The Fred McDarrah images they have are just remarkable. So I am ecstatic to see all of these legendary violins in person, in the flesh. I think that alone is incredibly exciting. And today I think we're just going to talk a bit about their experiences going through life in the Village when they did, and working at the Village Voice. I think of it kind of as like a school newspaper for the counterculture. And also like one of the most successful publications ever at being like truly of a time and a place, whatever that was. When it was the 60s, when it was the 80s, it really was, and the 90s. When I was reading it in high school, it was just, it reflected that place and that time so much better than anything else that we had. So we talked about it being a mirror, or branded earlier, and I wonder, in what ways is it a distorted mirror? In what ways is it accurate? Whose stories were and weren't told, and that's something I think we're going to get into a little bit. So I don't know if the author James Wolcott worked there at one point. He said he used to get calls all the time from people saying, "Where is the secret drop-off location?" Apparently there was this mythology that there was a kiosk somewhere that got the Voice before any other kiosk. And everybody wanted at that kiosk. There was not one. So the way it's going to work is this. I am going to ask a few questions. Everyone is going to have kind of an informal discussion, and then we're going to open it up to you all. So I'm going to start just by way of introduction to ask each of our panelists, how did they get started at the Voice? And maybe, what was their first assignment there? So I'd like to begin with Richard Goldstein, if that's okay with you. And I'm going to read your bio and then let you talk. So Richard Goldstein was the arts editor and executive editor at the Village Voice until 2014. He wrote for The Voice starting in 1966, where his pioneering column Pop Eye covered rock music, and his column Art Beat covered the visual arts world in the late 1970s. His writing on LGBT culture and politics received an award from GLAAD. Goldstein is an adjunct professor at Hunter College, and his memoir, Another Little Piece of My Heart, My Life of Rock and Revolution in the 60s, was published in 2015, and it's lovely, and I think it's for sale here. So.
How I got started at The Voice?
Yeah.
I got an interview with the editor, Tan Wolf, the founding editor of the paper. I was at Columbia Journalism School. I had hair down to my pupik, and I did. And teachers there all said, if you want to get a job in journalism, you have to cut your hair and learn to spell. And I didn't have any intention of doing either. So I went down to see Dan, and I said to him, I've written about this, and I said to him, I want to be a rock critic. And he looked at me and said, "What is that?" And I just said that I didn't know what it was, because basically as a profession, it didn't exist. There were a couple of zines. Some people were writing about it seriously, but there was no canon, there was no profession. It was what I call an open field, which is my favorite kind of writing to do. And so I went to Yankee Stadium, and I covered a concert with an incredible bill. I mostly wrote about the fans, because that's really what I knew. And then that Wednesday, I go down to the newsstand, and my article is like bannered, and I think a greater rush than any drug I've ever done is what I felt. So that was the start, and very soon I had a column, et cetera, et cetera.
That's great, thank you. Next, Susan Brownmiller. So Susan's a feminist scholar and writer, I'm sure you all know. She was a fact checker at Newsweek before she started writing at the Village Voice in 1965. Brownmiller has also written for the New York Times, Esquire, Vogue, Rolling Stone, The Nation, and many other publications. Her groundbreaking book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, was published in 1975 and really holds up distressingly well. Her other books include Shirley Chisholm, a biography from 1970, Femininity, 1984, Waverly Place, Seeing Vietnam, and In Our Time, Memoir of a Revolution, which came out in 1999. So how did you come to be at the Village Voice? And do you remember any of your
do anything, or is
hold
it
it right there? That's
just
it.
Hold it right here. I was working at Newsweek magazine as a fact checker. And I was drawn to the civil rights movement in the South. In Mississippi, there was a thing called Freedom Summer. And I left Newsweek and went south and was assigned to go to Meridian. After Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were abducted and gone missing, but before their bodies were found, that's when I hit Meridian. To make a long story short, I later went and worked in Jackson for what we called the Freedom Project, which by then was just had fallen apart after the 3 deaths. You know, it was sort of the end of hope for the civil rights movement. And also it was the media's end. They didn't care either. I mean, that seemed to be how the wonderful hoped for harmony of black and white together, it just seemed it was all over. So anyway, there I was in Jackson, and I found out that there were still some people in the movement trying to make a difference. And one thing was something called the cotton allotment elections, which is too complicated to go into. But I went with another volunteer, and we went to Panola County, and I wrote up this story because the mainstream press wasn't interested. So my friend Jack Newfield was working for the Village Voice then, so I sent him I mailed it to him, and I said, you know, my story that I wrote, I said, maybe you could use this in the Voice. And Dan Wolfe was very happy. He was very happy with it.
That's wonderful.
And it was printed. That was in December 1964.
Amazing.
I have seniority on this panel.
I also have to say that one of my favorite pieces by Susan Brownmiller was in 1971. It was called On Goosing, where she describes being goosed on 8th Street while handing out flyers and then spraining her ankle while trying to kick her attacker, which I think is a sadly relevant analogy to what's happened to.
Yes, I think those were my 2 most anthologized pieces.
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay,
Right.
and then to move on now, Gregory Tate, hello, who has the best hat in the room, was a staff writer at The Voice from 1987 to 2003. His work has also been published in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, among others. His books include Flyboy and the Buttermilk, Essays on American Culture, Midnight Lightning, Jimi Hendrix and the Black Experience, and Everything But the Burden, What White People Are Taking from Black Culture, which was published in 2003. He's also a musician and playwright with projects including Black Rock Coalition and Burnt Sugar. So can you tell us how you came to The Voice?
Oh, sure. So it's like later 70s, I was at Howard University, and I was a free jazz nerd, and I started reading The Voice because of Stanley Crouch, because he was reporting on all this exciting stuff they were calling loft jazz at the time. So that's how I became a Village Voice fan. And then my good friend Talani Davis went to work for the paper, I want to say around 79 or 80, and as a fact checker, but then she started writing, and I thought, you know, her pieces were really exciting as well. And so she told me, yeah, you need to send something, you should send something to the music editor, Robert Christgau. I said, okay. So it took me about a year to work up the nerve to do that, but I went to see a show of Nona Hendrix at local punk rock club, and got inspired and wrote this piece pretty much on the train ride home, and just stuck in an envelope, put a stamp on it, sent it to Christgau, and he called me up, I guess a couple of days after he got it, and he said, I can't use this, but the more writing like this I get in the paper, the better I'll like it, you know. So he gave me my first assignments, and we were off to the races.
That's great. I started out in the early in my career having to mail things, and it seems so much like 1,000 years ago. The putting things in envelopes. Guy Trebay, hello. So Guy reports on style and culture, as I'm sure you all know, from in the New York Times. He's a prolific and wonderful writer on fashion. Previously, he was a columnist and senior editor at The Voice, and he's written for publications including The New Yorker, Harper's, and Esquire. He's a 2-time winner of the Columbia School of Journalism's Mike Berger Award, a recipient of a Deadline Club Front Page Award, and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. A book of his work, In the Place to Be, Guy Trebay's New York, was published in 1994, and if you can get your hands on that, it's beautifully illustrated and beautifully written. And why don't you tell us how you came to The Voice?
I mean, I think I probably bumbled into it like most things in my life, and I had dropped out of high school, and I was kind of floating around with a no 5-year plan or 5-minute plan. And I was very friendly with the founder of the School of Correspondence Art, a guy called Ray Johnson. Pardon me, and he said that the arts editor needed a helper of some sort. And I didn't have any ambition to be a writer, let alone a journalist, but I needed work, and I went to see this person who almost immediately gave me a job and then left on vacation for a month. And then so I started doing it, whatever it was. And that sort of, I think, is the way I remember The Voice best. It was, it was a New York where if you said you could do a thing, people said, let's see.
That's lovely. And I'm wondering if you can each speak to the relationship between writers and editors at The Voice.
Fraught.
Maybe yes.
Fraught.
Okay, so I'm sure we've all heard stories along these lines. Maybe as a writer and editor, you can start, Richard.
Should I tell you the time a temporary cap flew out of my mouth
Please.
in rage and flew across the room during an editorial meeting? No, I mean, they could range from being total enmity to being, very close friendship, and everything in between. And we used to use, for much of the time, we used paper and copybooks and all of that. So I would cut up the story and try pasting it in a different order. It was like, I think Walcott once said it was like editing a film, But I was working with a lot of writers who weren't experienced as writers, but who had incredible sensibilities. And the whole philosophy that I learned from Dan Wolfe was, if you want to cover something, you get somebody who's living it, and don't worry about how well they write, because that you can work on with them. But make sure that they're embedded in the material that they're covering. So that's what I looked for, and as a result, there were a lot of amateurs, if you want to call them that, some of whom have gone on to great careers, but always a hegdish, a chaotic process of trial and error. And in the end, I should just add that the writer always got the writer's way. You could yell and scream. If the writer wanted to use a racial epithet or a sexual epithet, you could scream at them, but they would make the decision. And it was really, in the end, up to the writer what to do. At least that's how I remember it. Writers may remember it differently.
Any other writers remember editors getting their way occasionally?
Well, my first editor was the one and only Bob Christgau, Dean of American Rock Critics, which many writers will tell you is the, kind of the scariest editor alive. Because Bob gave grades to albums, A, B, C, D, F sharp.
And still does, I think, right?
Yeah,
Doesn't he have a blog where he does that still to this day?
But that's the way you felt sitting there. You were kind of waiting for judgment to come down. And, he'd start off in edit saying things like, well, this piece of shit, I don't know if we can even make it publishable. But then he'd work through with it. And then, you're talking about archaic editing processes. So you would bring in your typewritten manuscript, and you'd hand it to him. He'd make his notes, and then you both sit there, for a grueling process of going through it line by line. But as Richard said, the genius of voice editors was that they brought you as far within line of the style and grammar book as you wanted to be, And I was kind of notorious for making up words and making up syntax, and And Bob would figure out a way to allow that in the paper as long as it made some kind of sense to him, you know. But yeah, I mean, I had never been edited before then, so I learned what editing was, and a lot of what I learned from him allowed me to write publishable stuff in this era when there are very few editors left. So you kind of have to be your own Bob Christgau now in a lot of instances. You know.
That's great. Susan, did you have any experiences with editors that you want to share?
Is that for me?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Who was your?
Well,
who was
there
your?
was very little editing,
Yeah.
which was nice. You know, I owe everything to Dan Wolfe, who was the editor of the Village Voice, the editor, when the paper started and started to grow exponentially. It was just unbelievable that by, I was there, in the 60s and 70s, it was just becoming a behemoth, you know? We like to think, of course, that it was because of our writing, but there were the classifieds in the back, there were the apartment notices, there were the sex notices, you know, a lot of people bought the Voice for that. But among them, you know, I was around when feminism started. And I always felt that, except for Nat Hentoff, the Voice really was pro-abortion rights. There's no doubt about it. But then Nat would, you know, had a column. I never had a column. I was a street reporter. You know, Nat would fire off his answers. In fact, I think most people, you had a column, right? Yeah, you had a column. Yeah, so they could write whatever they want. I had to scramble every week to get my stuff in. And for $75, I had a...
You got $75? I got 20.
You're kidding! I'm so happy to hear that. Really? I thought you columnists all got more money. But I had a scramble for it, and I had a category, you won't believe this, I had a category at the unemployment insurance office called partially employed, because, I swear.
That's the writer's line.
Exactly.
Yeah, because the week that I turned in a story and it was printed and I got my $75, that was my partially employed week. But it didn't happen every week, but I tried very hard because I was bumping with friends who luckily and accidentally were living in the Village. So it was really very easy for me to get to the Voice, because it was then on Sheridan Square. And Ada, I would disagree with you because we felt that the drop-off point for the paper when it came out on Wednesday or Thursday, it changed. But it just seemed that the Sheridan Square book stand, the kiosk was the first.
I remember that that's the case, but I think it should be pointed out that they weren't looking for the writing; they were looking for the classified
The apartment listing.
ads.
Yeah, they were.
It was the
This is true.
apartments.
This is true.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I love that you mentioned Dan Wolfe, and I think, Richard, you've said that he sometimes did more therapy with writers than editing.
Well, you know, I'm describing the process of editing in the 70s and the 80s and all that. When I came there, as with you, there was no editing. There were two editors who just oversaw the whole paper, and they didn't edit.
Yeah.
So
Diane Fisher was one.
and Ross Weston.
And Ross eventually. Right. He started as the proofreader.
I didn't know that. But so when I arrived there, we would come in. Our desk would be the desk that the ad takers had during the day, and the writers had them at night. We would come in, and there'd be a big pile of cream puffs from Smilers, and across the street, and, the 24-hour. And then we would just eat these cream puffs and sometimes drink and write all night. and no drugs. I never saw drugs in the office. And then in the morning...
We worked in a different place.
No, I know. No, I know. I remember secretaries of the editor who were dealers for the paper, and going to the roofs to put out the paper stone, that too, but that was later. But then at 6 a.m., Dan would come in and collect everybody's copy and edit it on the tubes to the printer. And it would appear on Wednesday pretty much exactly as you wrote it,
Right.
meaning every comma that was wrong you would be embarrassed by. It is a very good way to learn writing, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'll go ahead. Do you want to say something?
Well, you were just asking about writer-editor relationships, and because I was so young when I got there, first newspaper experience, so everything that happened at The Voice I thought was normal. So, and one of the things that just brought sheer delight and spectacle to the office every week was our editor, publisher David Schneiderman had an office with a door and a window, a large window. And every week, Wayne Barrett and Joe Conason would be in there for probably about a half hour screaming on him and waving their arms around and just completely abusing him. You know what I mean? And he would just say, take it,
Right. One editor actually put his fist through the window because he had been denied an expense item by the publisher, and I won't name names, but we thought he had jumped out. And the door was closed, and we knocked timidly, and he opened the door, and there was this bloody hand, and we were relieved that it was only his hand. So. There were many, many incidents of physical violence at the paper.
It's a funny thing, and I'd like to make it a funny thing, but it was a very, very volatile workplace. Yeah. Maybe not the safest workplace by anybody's standards. And I think that this gets a little in the kind of mythologizing The Voice. It gets left out. There was certainly a place in which writers could be writers, and I don't think I've ever seen another place quite like that. And there was lots of support for writers as writers. I never had this relationship with editors where they were wrestling you to the ground or giving you a lot of...
We were afraid of you.
Well, as you should be. But I do remember tremendous amounts of people being chased up and down the office and desks being upended and people punching each other out and people pulling other people off. It was, I guess it was good in its way.
The guy was hospitalized because he had written an article saying that Beethoven was black. And another writer decked him, and
I don't remember this.
Harry Allen, I'm pretty sure. He had it and split his whole lip open, so we had to call an ambulance.
It's funny because working at the Times now, we're super, super, super sensitive to every triggering thing, and there the trigger might really be a trigger at The Voice with a gun attached.
Literal triggers at The Voice.
Isn't this traditional of New York journalism? Journalists used to be caned in the streets in the 19th century by the targets of their journalism. They would be waiting outside the office with a cane and would beat them.
Well,
at the hip hop magazine, The Source, that did happen. They had to put bulletproof glass up in the office, and a couple of writers did get beat up right outside of the office. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But also the Village, I think at that time was so surreal. And I had a similar experience of growing up there in the early 80s and thinking it was completely normal that everybody was sleeping in the lobby and people were nodding out on the street and people were screaming all night right under my window. And I went to Ohio for the first time when I was 12, and I'd never seen a kiddie pool or carpeting or a root beer float. And I came back, I was so mad. I was how did you not show me these things? So now, what does everybody get wrong about The Voice? I feel if we're talking about the mirror and distortions, are there myths or are there things people like to say about The Voice that you would like to say are not true?
Give me an example.
I think there's certain people who are maybe valorized, early in The Voice history. So maybe a Norman Mailer, these sort of a lot of straight white male glory stories about early Voice days.
I can say it was a crap place for gay people.
Okay, thank you.
It was crap.
Yeah.
And it got a little bit less crap, but it was super, super and very overtly homophobic for quite a long time. And finding a little space there, thanks to writers like Arthur Bell, gradually, some space was made for this experience. And I mean, feminism had its real estate in the Voice from the start, importantly. But I don't really feel that when gay liberation happened that there was necessarily an accommodation for that, or if there was, it was grudging.
The bathroom graffiti alone was memorable.
What was on the bathroom?
There are a lot of homophobic stuff. And there you were working among progressives. Everyone was progressive, and on this issue they were Neanderthals. And so it certainly freaked me out a lot, and it made me very unbalanced, which I acted out a lot at the paper because I was in a state of horror most of the time. So I agree, it was rough.
But they also had, this is maybe a little kind of overstating, but when finally gay people started to have a voice within the pages of the Village Voice, there was a disposition to favor a kind of writing that was gay writing and about gay subjects. And it wasn't a fully authorized presence for quite a while in my experience there. You know, you weren't at parody.
I mean, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about a homophobic voice, you know, because when the younger black writers started to come in, many of them were queer, you know. But I also just remember that because of kind of the uptick in coverage of gay community in New York, if I tell somebody uptown that I wrote for The Voice, frequently somebody say, "Oh, you write for that gay paper."
Yeah, that's what I would hear. You know, I'm working for a fag newspaper from the political writers sometimes.
That kind of proves the point as far as I'm concerned. You know, sort of the percentage-wise, the amount of coverage that related to the lives of gay people was quite small.
Well, I'd like to say something. I felt that the Village Voice was never one big happy family. I mean, that's a myth. Talk about myths. The writers were really competitive with each other, as we sort of had to be, because it was important to get the front page, you know? So there was a lot of carping, you know. The first watering hole was the Lion's Head, which was in Sheridan Square, just on Christopher. It was just very close to the Village Voice office. And that's where I didn't really fit in because I was never much of a drinker. But it was a very macho bar scene at the Lion's Head. And people were crapping about, she got the front page with that story? I have to say, because nobody said it yet, that The Voice was open to women in a way that certainly no mainstream magazine was in those days, or newspaper. Maybe some of it had to do with the fact that we were all paid, you know, so little that women would take that and, you know, and hopefully have, you know, other income from a husband or boyfriend or whatever. I don't know. But the number of women at The Voice was really extraordinary.
But I'd like to locate that in The Voice, and I certainly am super grateful to The Voice, and The Voice made me in a lot of senses, but The Voice existed within a context that itself is gone. And I think that the city of then and the cultural climate and the political climate of them was really much more productive of The Voice than The Voice was making anything, from my perspective.
Well, I think we should, you know, for those who maybe don't know, that the vision that Dan in particular, and also Ed Fancher, had. Their vision was to wipe out the bosses. Carmine DeSapio, you know, he was the political leader in the village, and Ed Koch was running against him, you know. And I think that the politics of the founders of The Voice really went no further than that. But as times changed and as, you know, decades moved on, The Voice became reflective of these later decades too. And that's natural.
Yeah, and you make this point of that
Yeah.
there was this interweaving from the start of writing about culture and activism. Do you all have watershed moments where you feel like those two things intersected?
What are the two things?
The two things are culture and activism.
Well, I always bounce back and forth between political activism and writing. I mean, that was characterized my life for a very, very long time. I organized events that were, I organized. Well, first of all, I wrote the first article ever on the Red Stockings Abortion Speak Out. Yeah, the first time that women in New York or anywhere actually had actually called a meeting at a church in the village and talked about their experiences, mostly with not being able to get an abortion. And that story I know was picked up by the LNS, Liberation News Service, and it went around the country, so that was real helpful. Go ahead, I'll let other people talk.
Well, just, I evolved during the 60s from being a rock critic to covering the New Left. And I covered all the riot, the Chicago Convention riot in 68 and the Columbia University uprising in 68. And I, wrote about the Black Panthers and other groups in San Francisco. And this evolution, for me, I just transferred my awe from rock stars to political radicals, and Abby Hoffman and Tom Hayden. I knew those people and hung out with them. The reason I'm talking about this is because I was allowed to do that. And you could evolve at the paper from beat to beat, depending on where your consciousness was leading you. And I think that is one of the unique things. Jill Johnson was a dance
I'm
writer.
glad you mentioned her.
And then she
I don't know if her name resonates with you all.
Do people know Jill
amazing,
Johnson?
an amazing person.
But she was amazing. She started as a dance critic.
Right.
And then very soon she was into Lesbian Nation
Right,
politics.
she had
It was really
Yeah, she had a column, and
every week. You
Right.
never knew what Jill was going to say.
Right.
Did you have a legendary encounter with Norman Mailer?
I believe it involved kissing, to Mailer's embarrassment.
Yeah,
Maybe I have
I
that
got
wrong.
her that gig. That's
You
a
did?
thing.
I mean, Mailer was. Go ahead.
No, there was this event called Town Hall, something or other, and it was Norman Mailer was in charge, and they were going to have Germaine Greer talk, and somebody from Now, Jackie Ceballos, and I got a call from the Theater for the Ideas, and they, I've never admitted this, they said, "We hear you're a radical feminist. Would you like to be on the panel?" I'm not going to go near this. I said, "No, but I have somebody for you, Jill Johnston."
It's a really good YouTube viewing. It's out
And
there.
it's true. She went, and within a few minutes, she and her women friends by design were rolling on the floor, and Norman was saying, "Jill, be a lady, be a lady."
He was either going to kiss you or box you, and he offered to box me, actually, in
Yeah.
the office once, and I fled from him.
That's great. So and now you mentioned the context, which I think is very important in the context of the village then, whether it's the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, and now is very different. And one thing that you mentioned, Guy, in your book that I love so much was 8th Street, the stretch off Broadway that you said was perpetually bathed in the warm, greasy breeze of the Riviera Cafe's exhaust fan, where people sold stuff on the street. Do people remember this? So when I was interviewing people who'd worked at Boy Bar on St. Mark's Place, they described it as Bummingdales. Bummingdales, like Bloomingdales, because they would buy a lot of clothes there. So I'm wondering if you can each talk about, was there a place, like you mentioned, the Lion's Head, was there a spot in the village that to you really epitomized the era that meant a lot to you?
Which era?
Whatever meant most to you. So I should say, like, when I was working on my book, I interviewed a couple hundred people who had lived on St. Mark's Place at various times, and they almost all said there was like one moment that was really phenomenal, and I'd be like, oh, what year was it? And they'd say, like, it was obviously 66 or 82 or 2017. They always had like 1 year, and it was almost always when they were 19.
It's funny because I don't like, I mean, maybe I'm being bolshy or something. I mean, I don't really locate the Village Voice in the Village, and I never did. I mean,
Interesting.
So I don't have I never was a Cedar Bar person or the Lion's Head, or it felt to me like the Village Voice was a notion that was like a passport to all parts of the city, and that was the richest part of the experience for me. And Sylvia Plahy and I would get in a car every week, and and I can't believe that you could even have such a thing as a column in which you never knew what you were going to do, and you would get in a car and go to the South Bronx or go to Coney Island or go to any part of a city that was fairly run down. I was late 70s into 80s, and kind of wonderfully, magically open, and with lots of margins and lots of things happening in those spaces, all those liminal spaces and interstitial spaces where I can't, now everything, of course, has been, it's mauled out and theme parked, but it feels to me like the Voice was much more emblematic of that than it was of a place or a hangout or anything like that.
I guess I often used to look for where Fred McDarrah was and try to follow him, because he had the most amazing nose and legs of a journalist. He knew exactly where to be, so I would often follow his lead to go to places. But the place I most remember was the sidewalk in front of the office where we gathered during the bomb threats, which surely you remember. It happened several times a year. Several times a year I would have to go to the writers and say, stop smoking dope, the police are coming. And we would all have to vacate the office and stand on the sidewalk for like an hour. Once somebody sent a champagne glass to it might have been you, as a kind of a gift. and it broke in the box, and so the guard thought it might be a bomb. But so many people hated us and threatened to bomb us that we would end up on the sidewalk, and those were highly social occasions, I think.
Well, it's interesting because I was living first in Brooklyn and then in Harlem, but up until the last 10 years or so, I probably spent more time in the Village than I did uptown. And two cornerstone institutions, certainly for myself and my Black Rock Coalition cronies, were CBGBs, which completely embraced us, coming in and taking over the space. We do these all Black programs for 3-night festivals for 3 nights running. So Hilly Crystal, really, really important person in terms of that. And then Linda Good Bryant, who's now kind of having a victory lap around the art world. She had a space called Jam, and she was the first Black woman to have like a major avant-garde conceptual art gallery in Soho. And she gave us our first kind of meeting space for about the first 2 years. So you had people who really represented the best of the spirit of the Village at that time, really, opening their doors to wild-ass young people wanting to tear shit up.
Well, what I remember most about The Voice was what a really bad writer I was when I started writing for The Voice, and how out of step my writing was with a lot of the others. I was afraid to use the I pronoun, and that The Voice is known for I. Yes. But, I had been at Newsweek where everything was third person, ending with, and at week's end, we report this, that, So the only thing I knew about journalism was that you don't use the I word. But yes, at The Voice, I eventually learned it, began to practice it. To Dan Wolf's great relief, actually, because sometimes he had to write in the a little note in a piece I wrote before I used the I word. Miss Brownmiller knew Janice Wiley. This was the Career Girl Murders case. Miss Brownmiller knew Janice Wiley at Newsweek, and she also knew Nathan Delaney, who falsely accused Roberto Cruz del Valle in East Harlem. I mean, he had to give a note for that. But, that was, I think, part of the wonder of The Voice, that you could grow as a writer. Because actually they didn't want professional writers. I mean, Dan Wolfe would always say, I don't want slick professional writers. He didn't want that.
But he did want writers. I mean, there's a real distinction to be made there, because I think it was like the kind of hackery that obtained at that moment was the thing that they were going away from. And also the culture was, and it was open, and they were making a lot of money, and they could afford to do that.
Well, yes, they were
And
making a lot of money.
Also, we made 2 cents. as
I
everybody
know.
points
Well,
out.
that's another thing we should really discuss, because there came a time when writers for The Voice realized that the owners, Dan and Ed Fancher, really, were making a hell of a lot of money. And they had summer houses and co-ops, and we were all still not unionized or not being paid a living wage. But they knew that The Voice was the best showcase in town for emerging writers. They knew that before I knew it, And then I started to get letters, from editors and agents. If you ever have a book in you, would you please? Everything was done by letter, And I had a file of people who hoped one day I'd have a book in me. And then when I did have a book, I picked out an agent and an editor from the list, and I signed a contract with Simon & Schuster for the book that 4 years later became Against Our Will. Slow writer. But I was writing a history of rape. But when I turned it in, they had almost forgotten about my book. I had signed a stupid contract to deliver this book in 1 year, and it took close to 4 years. But when I turned it into absolute silence from my editor. He had another book that he was very interested in, another person, and it wasn't me. But I called Dan, because Dan had told me that he had a house on Fire Island near Dick Snyder's house, Dick, the head of Simon & Schuster. And Dan said, I'll call my friend Dick. And he did. And then they noticed that I had turned in my book after 4 years.
That's great. So we're going to have to open it up to questions pretty soon, but I want to ask one more question so you all can think in the next 5 minutes about what you want to ask these writers. So we talked about the beginning, we've talked about the middle, and could you each maybe speak to the end of your time at the Village Voice, or the end of the Village Voice period?
Oh, well, I sued the paper.
Right?
Because the editor, I'm sorry he's passed away, but he was a homophobe, and he drove me crazy and insulted my body on many occasions. And I was a little ahead of my time, because if this had happened 10 years later, I probably would be a rich man. But I did sue them, But, that, I guess, I don't know, it doesn't doesn't change my feelings for the whole experience of the paper. So the end of it was just the end of it. And can I just say one thing, which is that we did form a union. I think it's I know this is not your question, but and we did it when Rupert Murdoch bought the paper, because Rupert Murdoch, and so we went to the newspaper guild, and they said, well, we can't represent freelancers, so we'll represent just the staff. And we said, no, you have to represent everybody, and they wouldn't do it. So then we went to this so-called commie union, District 65, and they said, sure, come on. And so they became our wonderful organizers. We had a wonderful Kitty Krupat, a wonderful organizer. And we were the only Murdoch publication to ever form a union under his stewardship. And we did. It was one of the best things about the paper. It had an affirmative action program, and it was the first entity to force the employer to have same-sex health coverage in the whole country, for which I thank Jeff Weinstein for bringing this to bear. But so The Voice became the first place to do that because of the union.
But actually, domestic partnership benefits, but bargaining unit freelancers was a huge thing because there was no way to cover this completely blob-weight group of people, and then domestic partners, which in the end advantaged more straight couples than it did gay couples, but the impetus was to make sure that people of same-sex partnerships could have some kind of coverage.
You're right. It was anybody could apply to it.
correct.
Yeah, but it was a union thing, and the rank and file made it a strike issue, which I thought was so moving to me that the whole staff would come together around this.
Yeah. Well, you reminded me of the healthcare plan. I had a friend whose mother worked in the industry, and she looked over our plan. She said, "This is one of the best healthcare plans in the country." You know? But I also remember, I think one of the human personnel execs told me that we use access to psychological therapy more than any other
No surprise.
news journalistic enterprise in the city. But
Not that it worked.
yeah, but it was there. It was like one of those bases that was definitely covered, And if you needed it 3 times a week,
See, they didn't have Dan to come to with their problems. You couldn't sit down with Dan and he would tell you what your syndromes were, which he did to me. So.
What were they?
Well, okay, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what he said.
Now's the therapy portion
he, you know,
of
he
the
did.
afternoon.
He said, Richard, most people escape from reality, but you escape into reality. And I thought, that has stayed with me for all these years.
That's a good blurb.
Yeah, but if you talk about what I remember about the end, because the end happened before the end, was that I was there in that transition when those Bushites bought the paper and completely gutted the political reporting, and that's why throughout the entirety of the Bush-Cheney years, there's like not a ripple to be read in the pages of The Voice. So that was the end, as far as I was concerned, and probably for a lot of you as well.
Guy, do you have an end of your time at The Voice story or end of The Voice period story?
I really don't, because I left in 2000, and I don't really have an end of The Voice. Things end. It
Yeah.
ended for me.
Yeah.
Or it didn't end. I moved on.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Lots of people, yes. Do we need to wait for the mic? Okay, it's running toward you.
Wonderful panel. Greg, I think it was you who briefly mentioned Wayne Barrett.
Yes.
At that time when he was investigating, given today's political climate, he was investigating Trump's discriminatory housing. Were any of you ever involved in any of that, even tangentially? And how big of an impact did it have within the paper when this was going on, or was it not really recognized until later on, like how in depth and what the extent of what Trump's, his practices had upon the city?
I just remember that Wayne was, a tremendous institution at the paper, immensely respected. I was the one who had to console his interns, who would come into my office crying because he was very hard on his interns. And I would just always say, think of how much you're learning. And of course, they were mollified because they were learning a tremendous amount. And I was his editor for a time because the former editor he had reduced to tears. And that, I'm telling you the color stories about Wayne, but he was I think he was immensely admired by all of us. And I regarded him, it was well worth the tourist because he was a true political intellectual. And I did learn a tremendous amount from him. So that's my way.
Well, of course, me too. I mean, Wayne Barrett and Jack Newfield were the two muckrakers for many, many years at The Voice. And And they wrote about Rudy Giuliani, too. Back then, they knew he was a danger. Yeah, it was remarkable. It was.
Yeah, Wayne threw his pencil at Giuliani when Giuliani
Hold
came
it
for an
close to you.
endorsement. The pencil-
Closer to your mouth.
What's that?
The mic closer. Yeah.
Okay, I just remember Wayne throwing his pencil at Giuliani at an endorsement meeting.
Yeah.
He started out admiring Giuliani, but then he realized,
Mm-hmm.
and so he turned, and they had quite a face-off at
This
an
is why
endorsement.
journalists need ninja stars.
Yeah, but I'll just add too that before I left, one of the last interns I remember seeing Wayne work with was a guy named Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi Coates was there. Yeah.
All right, next question. Where's the microphone? You want to go there?
Yeah, I was just curious if, as I remember back, there was another publication called the East Village Other, and whether I don't remember a lot about it. I was pretty young, except crazy stories about the way they edited, which was to add scatological references all the time. And I was wondering if there was any interaction with the Voice at that time.
I think we didn't feel that they were much competition. But,
I think wasn't it like Xeroxed? And I have some old copies.
yeah,
No,
but
they were-
Claudia Dreyfus had started at the East Village Other.
I mean, there was the
She
Soho
overcame
News.
it, huh?
There was the Soho News.
Yeah.
My favorite was
Yeah.
The Rat.
Oh.
That was my favorite competition to The Voice. Yeah.
You're
the
joshing.
Vince Aletti was the only male allowed at the paper, I think. I think he was the rock critic.
He's such a rat.
He's such a rat. Yeah, I think he was the rock critic of The Rat when he started.
Yes, down in the front. Can we get a microphone here? Sorry to make you run.
Thanks. I just wanted to know what happened to The Voice. Why did it fold?
That's a long story.
Which time?
Good point.
Yeah, it folded gradually.
So I was on one of the last covers, and they were like, "Oh, come pick up a copy of it so you can have the picture." And I went there, and it was like a ghost town. They were down around South Street Seaport then, and it was like 3 people in this sea of cubicles. It was very, very depressing.
Well, I was told that the problem was Craigslist, that Craigslist basically supplanted our classified ads and took that base of the paper's advertising out. The sex ads, I remember that the publisher wanted them out and doubled the price, but they paid the new freight, so they stayed. And I think that the internet had a lot to do with.
I mean, certainly, like you could say, like where did the ads go? The ads went online, but then you could also say where did the left go? And I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah,
So
I think
sex ads and
I
politics.
think the left maybe is a lot less self-critical now than it was when I worked at The Voice. And, bashing the left to the left was an honorable pursuit. But now I think you can get canceled forever for doing it. So it is a different left now.
Interesting. Okay, maybe someone over here. They're in the second row. One of you two. You can fight it out.
Here? Second row.
Oh wait, microphone coming. Thank you.
I'm curious, when you guys first started, did you make enough money at The Voice to support yourself, or did you have to have like a side gig?
There was some of this talk backstage.
Yeah, I was just telling him that when I moved to the city in '82, I found an apartment in Fort Greene, and I could basically pay my rent writing 2 record reviews for the music section, and still have money left over for pizza and falafel and ramen noodles.
The sound you hear are all the young journalists like weeping in the back row, because that is not true anymore.
I mean, I was well paid in the long run, so I don't have any complaints about that. I did notice that writers stole pens, toilet paper, bulbs, all had to be put under lock and key. And any kind of china that anyone was stupid enough to bring in for the meals that they gave us when we had to stay late.
No, I had a mentor in D.C. that told me writers need institutions. But it wasn't until I got to The Voice I realized, writers need office supplies.
That's good. Susan?
Well, I have something that I think about a lot is that not all the voice writers could write in long form. They could write short form, an article length. And some just couldn't master the the skill and put the time into a full-length book. Yeah, so that was always something about.
I'm always a little bit leery of this because it sounds like geezer gab, but it's like the city was so different. The idea that you could have a $75 a month apartment and split it with a buddy, and and it wasn't uniquely oneself. It was, and so if they were paying, let's say, probably $10,000 a year salary, that was pretty adequate.
Yeah, I think my parents' place on St. Mark's Place was like, it was either $175 a month or $150 if they painted it themselves. Yes, maybe you're right next to you. Oh.
I can speak. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to know if you want to speak to the quality of fact-checking in the Village Voice, because I had an experience in 2001 where I was interviewed by Jennifer Gonerman because I had been a juror who helped a guy trying to get a better second trial. And she recorded the interview and everything, was very careful, and I got calls for fact-checking. Later on, I was the New York Times person. I don't think their crime section is very good. Anyhow, never even recorded anything, never even took notes, and completely got it all mixed up when she wrote it. So there, in that particular case, the Village Voice was head and shoulders above the New York Times.
And in a lot of ways, I think this gets left out. The Voice was very, very, very professionally organized. I mean, there was nothing like willy-nilly about the structure there, and things were properly edited and properly fact-checked. It might have been looking like, Exquisite Corpse or something, or, clipping and throwing it in the air. But really, the structures were strong.
So yeah, we had an incredibly active fact-checking department. I know because I made errors in my book without it. So I know what a difference they made. And then we had an attorney, Victor Kovner, who had to put up with the most outlandish kinds of things. Can I tell a slightly obscene story?
Who's against the obscene story? Does anybody need to do earmuffs?
So I wrote a piece about Harvey Milk, a very famous gay politician in San Francisco, and I get this call from Victor saying, Richard, how do we know Harvey Milk was gay? Because that's a standard libel question in those days. And I couldn't believe it. And I said, Victor, I fucked him. So there was this pause. And he said, Richard, I'm serious.
All right, let's see, maybe all the way in the back. I've been neglecting the back because of the light.
Yeah, this has been great. I connected a lot with the political writers, Newfield and Conason and Barrett, Coburn, Jim Ridgway. Did they get along? Did they argue with each other? Who was the biggest pain in the ass out of that group?
I think Conason was everybody's friend. Yeah. I think they got along fine, and that wasn't a problem. That wasn't a problem. They respected one another.
Those guys were
Yeah.
that was a posse, let's face it, and so they of course got along. Did they get along with the rest of us? Not necessarily. I mean, things were pretty balkanized at that point, and I think that the contempt in general that they felt for culture people as being unserious across the board was made clear to culture people. So
I had to shoehorn, in a way, coerce them to admit a more balanced group for endorsing candidates, namely women and people of color, because there was only one woman among them, and
Who's
it really
them at that
that was Maria Lorino.
Uh-huh.
But other than her, there was nobody. They were all white guys. They were all straight white guys, and it was I had a big battle with them because they felt that these other people didn't have the expertise that they had. But I said, but they're voters. They care about this, and we have to have a balanced crew. So it wasn't so easy. And I had enormous respect for them. And nobody ever tried to mess with their copy or anything like that. But to get them to, as Guy said, just to admit a less parochial group of people, that was very difficult.
Well, I remember they had a dedicated first 20 pages of the paper. So some of those arguments that used to see going on in Shinerman's office were about some artsy fartsy piece that had taken up some pages that they wanted to extend some expose they were working on that week. So.
That's great. Okay, so we only have a few more minutes, but then everybody's going to go up to second floor for drinks, right? So we can continue this over cocktails. But we have time for a few more, maybe over here.
There was a part of what The Voice did that you haven't talked about. I spent my life basically as a community organizer, involved with a citywide coalition of small neighborhood groups that were doing daycare and early childhood, and then another coalition started by Ruth Messinger that was hundreds of small community organizations throughout the city. And The Voice was the only place you could read about any of us. It covered the kinds of things that we were doing. Wayne Barrett did, many of the other writers did too. And it was a great boon, I think, nowadays of the times with its, quote, metropolitan coverage, unquote, which I don't think has ever been to Bedford-Stuyvesant except to talk about the new brownstones being renovated there. So that was an aspect of The Voice that I remember, and that, of course, everybody I knew read The Voice way out in the boroughs because that's where you could read about these things. It was a great thing.
That's how I first came across my guy, my husband, I have to say, with a sense of shock, because he was on Jack Newfield's good guy list as an organizer. So I'm aware of that.
Best Jack Newfield call ever, I think.
That's nice. But it is true that that's sort of missing now. There isn't the same kind of small town coverage. Like New York Magazine doesn't do it, like maybe some blogs, but it's not the same sense of community. I think that's a good point. Who else needs to, maybe somebody on this side? Yes, please.
Just a logistic question. I'm sorry for the ignorance. But
Please.
I didn't know, is it a free paper? Was it a free paper? And how was it distributed? How widely throughout the city?
It went
Did you
free.
get a subscription, or did you have to pay at the
No, you bought it.
It changed over time, so it's a
He
good
bought
question.
it at the newsstand. Very few people had subscriptions. Out-of-town people had subscriptions. Otherwise, it was a newsstand publication. At some point, under Schneiderman, it went free.
It was because of the threat of Time Out New York coming in. And so it actually, as I was told, advertising purposes, it actually worked out better for The Voice, because they could have it in more places and then claim more readership and then jack the ad rates up to compete. Yeah.
No, they went free and bought themselves another decade by going free. Yeah.
Right. It cost like $2 or something like that. But then at some point, it was decided that we'd be better as a freebie. So we did. It was an owner named Leonard Stern who decided that. So then we were free.
All right, let's maybe over here. Back.
Yeah, a few of you have referred to the changes in New York and just how expensive the city is, the steamroller gentrification, the effect that has on the city's cultural and political life. Listening to you and looking at the exhibit upstairs, it's the number of people who were not widely known at the time but became widely known later, who were involved in the kind of cultural ferment and political ferment that The Voice drew on, is really striking. I'm wondering if any of you, if there's somebody today in New York that's hanging on and raising hell that is not widely known that you think should be better known, you want to tell us about.
I kind of ask myself this all the time, and I'm very fearful of looking at it that way, because that was the joy of The Voice for me. Because when I went to this culture section and was kind of given this amazing hunting license, as they called it, to cover all that stuff, this unbelievable efflorescence of culture that was happening in all kinds of ways, and everyone who is now considered a master, so many people who are the masters now was in some little loft or some little anything throughout the city, and I think I would hear about it if it were happening now, but then I fear that I must not have my ear to the ground in the right way. Largely, I have to say I don't know where those people could afford to be here, so maybe they're in Kansas City.
So the internet makes that very difficult to answer, because there are thousands of people who are doing interesting work on the internet, and it's impossible to keep up with them.
I mean, I moderated a panel at Brooklyn Public Library a couple of weeks ago that was called, my brother organized it, so I should remember the title, but it's but something along the lines of, it was called Till Victory Comes, you know. So there were panels of many activists who were actively engaged in work, you know, particularly in Black, Latinx communities in the city. And I mean, I can tell you that if you heard any of those people on the panel, you'd want to join their army now. But to the point, we don't have a voice to actually do those kind of pieces that actually kind of raise the profile of people doing all this important work, you know, in our town, you know, important progressive work.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that, like, so my son goes to school in Times Square. He's a teenager, and so I'm around all these young people who are just like phenomenally talented, and they're so smart, and they're so progressive in all these interesting ways. And I think they're going to do wonderful things, and we might not have a voice that's going to highlight them to us, so it's going to be harder to see possibly. But I think they're there. Maybe all the way in the back. Yeah.
Speaking of culture, I know that The Voice was instrumental in the Obie Awards and starting with the off-Broadway and off-Broadway world down there at the theater, correct? Did you guys write for that as well? Any of you up there?
Extremely important, extremely important. And thank you for filling in something we didn't.
No, that's okay. I'm one of those internet people that have something called Socially Sparked. And the Village Voice has totally sparked our lives. So that's why I'm here, because you influenced me. So,
yes, there's no doubt that a large portion of the readership read the paper to find out what was going on off Broadway, and The Voice was the place for that.
All right, I think we might have time for like one more question. One more, and then we can continue it over drinks. Who wants to end us on a nice note? Anybody over here in this side?
I don't know if it's a nice note, but
no pressure.
There hasn't been too much talk about story, and to your point, Guy, I'm curious about what did you learn, each of you, about story structure, reporting, editing, that was invaluable, that's still a part of your tools of the trade today?
Learn from The Voice? You know, I think that if I were going to be honest, I think the thing is what the brilliance of the editors of The Voice is they saw talent and they cultivated talent, and I don't really believe that it can be taught, writing. So I think that they, you know, some technical stuff, and one developed skills of. I mean, I literally backed into this. I had no idea that what journalism was, and a former colleague was remarking earlier on that I used to walk around with. I took notes on a legal pad. You can imagine how. Incognito that would be.
Well, I would add something, and that's having a friendship network. When I got to The Voice and I was told, listen, you won't be covering this because these people cover that, and you can't do that, and you know. But I had friends who were connected to stories that weren't going to appear in the New York Times. I mean, it had to be under the radar. And they would give me tips about something that was happening somewhere or another. And that was just the ideal Voice story for me. I mean, one friend told me that she knew, and so did some of her friends know, this undercover police officer who had infiltrated New York Core and tried to lead them toward very destructive acts, you know? So that was a big hit for me to be able to tell his story.
I mean, I learned that I had a voice as a writer that was distinguishable, because when I would get assignments or calls for assignments from places like the New York Times, they would say, can you write in a way other than your voice style? You know, and that's because that license to ill was cultivated at The Voice.
Well, people always thought I was tall from my writing. I can often be told that. I mean, here's how I learned what I learned most from the paper was to be I was sitting next to somebody on the subway. They're looking at my article. At a certain point, they go, and they turn the page. And I say, what made them turn the page? And that was, I think, the greatest lesson that I learned.
Great. Well, I think we have our boss, Fran, coming up to say goodbye to us now.
It's a perfect note to end on, reading The Voice on the subway.